But beyond the crimes that shocked the world, there are new revelations that shed light on Epstein's chilling and bizarre obsession. They are even more disturbing and unreal. Well, reports suggest that Epstein was fascinated by transhumanism. He dreamt of creating a so-called super race of humans using his own DNA. He reportedly believed that through artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, he could cheat death and live forever. The revelations deepen concerns about Epstein's manipulation of science, wealth, and influence.
There's a particular reference Epstein makes to Africa, and he says, "I do a lot of work in Africa," and he refers to Africa as fertile ground for experimentation.
A scandal explodes in the West. A billionaire falls. Headlines talk about private islands, powerful friends, and one of the darkest elite networks in modern history. But once the noise fades, another question begins to surface, one that rarely makes the headlines. Why did the same man appear in conversations about Africa, global philanthropy, and the future of science? Why were elite trips, development projects, and research discussions quietly intersecting with the African continent? And why does Africa keep appearing whenever powerful Western institutions start talking about humanity's future? Let's find out. The first mystery is simple, but revealing. How did a man with no formal training in biology, genetics, or medicine suddenly appear in conversations about the future of humanity? The answer begins with something that has shaped Western influence for centuries: money. Jeffrey Epstein understood that financial power could open doors that credentials alone could not. Scientific research, especially cutting-edge research, is expensive. Laboratories require advanced equipment, universities depend on funding, and many ambitious projects struggle to secure financial support. Wealthy donors, therefore, occupy a unique position in academia. They can fund conferences, sponsor research discussions, and connect scientists with resources that traditional institutions cannot always provide. Epstein used this reality to position himself inside elite intellectual circles. Over time, he cultivated relationships with professors, researchers, and technologists from some of the most influential universities in the United States and Europe. He hosted private gatherings where scientists were invited to discuss ambitious questions about humanity's future. These were not typical academic conferences with large audiences and published proceedings. They were small, exclusive meetings designed to encourage bold speculation about emerging technologies. At these gatherings, the topics often ranged widely. Artificial intelligence, human evolution, space colonization, and genetic engineering were all subjects of discussion. Epstein listened closely, asked questions, and presented himself as someone fascinated by long-term scientific possibilities. To many researchers, he appeared to be a wealthy enthusiast willing to support ambitious ideas that might struggle to find funding elsewhere.
I mean, it's unfortunate you don't always know your donors as well as you would like, even if other people do. He liked attending meetings with scientists, cutting-edge scientists were talking. So I would go to meetings mostly because the scientists were there, and he, you know, it's. I didn't feel like I was being particularly bold by listing all of my donors on my website. I still do that, but you never know who's going to end up being.
But his involvement went beyond casual curiosity. Epstein reportedly pushed conversations toward the topic that fascinated him the most: human genetics. He was intrigued by the idea that science might eventually influence human evolution. According to several scientists who later spoke about their interactions with him, Epstein frequently asked about genetic inheritance, intelligence, and the possibility that biological traits could shape the trajectory of civilization. These questions were controversial even before the scandals surrounding him became public. They touched on debates that scientists approach with caution because of their historical association with controversial theories about human improvement. Yet Epstein's financial influence meant he could remain present in these conversations. This reveals something important about the structure of modern knowledge networks. Scientific authority is built through expertise, but access to those networks can sometimes be influenced by wealth. Individuals with financial resources can sponsor events, fund research programs, and cultivate relationships with leading academics. Over time, those connections grant them proximity to the ideas shaping the future. For Epstein, that proximity created an unusual vantage point. He was not conducting experiments or publishing research papers, but he was listening to discussions about the most advanced scientific fields of the century. And the more those conversations turned toward genetics and human evolution, the more one geographic region kept appearing in the background of the discussion: Africa. Because anyone studying the deep history of human biology eventually encounters the same reality. The continent contains the richest and most diverse human DNA on Earth.
And so it turns out that Epstein was a major funder of this weird artificial intelligence lab being created in Ethiopia that's tied to this scientist who's overtly transhumanist that he funded extensively, named Benjamin Goertzel. Goertzel is, for example, head of Humanity Plus, formerly the World Transhumanist Association, which is an entity that Epstein funded in addition to funding Goertzel's own work. And Goertzel is also the chief scientist at Hanson Robotics, which has produced these human-like robots, the best well-known probably being Sophia, the robot that was, for example, granted citizenship by Mohammed bin Salman at a time when one of his close advisors was Jeffrey Epstein. Again, very odd activity there. So as far as what was going on in Ethiopia, at the time that Epstein was investing in this AI lab.
So if Epstein had access to elite scientific circles, another question naturally follows. Did his influence ever tangibly reach Africa? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. One of the most documented connections between Epstein and the continent comes from a trip in 2002 involving former US President Bill Clinton. Flight records show that Clinton traveled on Epstein's private jet during a tour connected to development and humanitarian discussions in Africa.
Have you ever had contact with an individual by the name of Shantae Davies?
I believe Shantae that's a distinctive name, and so I think that was the name of one of his flight attendants.
Okay. She's been described on being on a 2002 Africa trip and providing massages. Was she or any other young female on that trip underage at that time?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did you ever receive a massage or have physical contact from her or anyone else on that trip?
You've seen the pictures. There was one time when I was sitting up and I got a back rub, a neck rub.
Okay.
And I think Shantae did it, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
At the time, the trip was framed as part of broader international efforts to address poverty, healthcare challenges, and economic development across the continent. Clinton had already begun working on initiatives focused on global health and development through what later became the Clinton Foundation. Epstein's presence in this context was curious. He was not a diplomat, a development expert, or a humanitarian organizer. Yet his aircraft, his logistical support, and his connections allowed him to move inside the same spaces where global development conversations about Africa were taking place. That raises an interesting possibility. For wealthy individuals seeking influence, philanthropy can function as a powerful gateway. By associating themselves with development projects, charitable missions, or humanitarian initiatives, they gain access to political leaders, international institutions, and high-profile public figures. Africa often becomes the stage where these networks intersect. In the early 2000s, the continent was the focus of major global campaigns related to debt relief, HIV/AIDS treatment, and poverty reduction. Governments, foundations, and international organizations were all expanding their involvement in African development programs. These environments created opportunities for elite networks to form. Trips, conferences, and humanitarian missions brought together politicians, business leaders, philanthropists, and researchers in the same spaces. Even individuals who were not directly running aid programs could gain visibility simply by participating in these efforts. Epstein appeared to understand the value of this positioning. By associating himself with scientific funding and philanthropic circles, he crafted an image of someone interested in global progress. This image helped him move through elite environments where influence and reputation mattered. Africa became one of the places where that image-building strategy intersected with real-world events. The 2002 trip with Clinton illustrates how Epstein was able to insert himself into conversations about development and global cooperation involving the continent. It did not mean he was running projects on the ground, but it demonstrated that his networks extended into the same international spaces where Africa's future was being discussed. For observers looking back today, the trip reveals something important about how global elite networks operate. Access is often less about official titles and more about proximity. If someone controls resources, transportation, or funding, they can become part of conversations normally reserved for political leaders or institutional actors. But once Epstein began appearing around development trips and elite discussions involving Africa, another layer of the story began to emerge. Because philanthropy was not the only arena where his interests intersected with the continent. The next question becomes even more intriguing. Beyond travel and elite connections, did Epstein also try to position himself inside scientific projects connected to Africa? The answer to the previous question is complicated, but it opens an important window into how Epstein's influence operated. After establishing himself inside elite development and political circles, Epstein began pushing deeper into another world where global power quietly accumulates: scientific research. Unlike traditional philanthropists who publicly fund hospitals or schools, Epstein preferred something more subtle. He directed money towards scientific programs, research meetings, and academic discussions about the future of technology and human biology. This strategy allowed him to enter spaces where scientists, innovators, and investors were discussing ideas that could shape the next century. And some of those scientific projects had direct connections to Africa. One of the clearest examples comes from Epstein's donations to scientific initiatives linked to particle physics research in South Africa. Through contributions connected to the science initiatives, Epstein's financial footprint appeared in academic projects involving African researchers and institutions. On the surface, this looked like something entirely positive. Institutions were created to strengthen scientific education across Africa. They focus on training young African mathematicians and scientists who can contribute to global research in fields such as physics, computing, and data science. Support from international donors helped these programs expand opportunities for students across the continent. But Epstein's involvement raises an important question about how elite influence sometimes enters the scientific world. He was not simply donating to charity, he was embedding himself in networks of researchers working on frontier science. By supporting programs that connected Western institutions with African research initiatives, he gained proximity to academic communities discussing advanced scientific questions. This pattern fits the broader strategy Epstein used throughout his life. Instead of building visible public projects, he placed himself quietly inside influential intellectual networks. Funding research, sponsoring conferences, and supporting educational initiatives gave him access to scientists who were shaping conversations about technology, mathematics, and biology. Africa entered that ecosystem because of the continent's growing importance in global science. Programs were part of a larger effort to build research capacity within Africa, attracting partnerships with universities and research groups around the world. For Epstein, supporting these initiatives helped reinforce the image he cultivated: a wealthy patron of science interested in the long-term future of humanity. But there is another layer to consider. When wealthy individuals fund research institutions or scientific programs, they are not only contributing resources, they are also gaining entry into intellectual environments where powerful ideas are discussed. Those environments influence how the world thinks about technology, medicine, and the direction of scientific progress. So Epstein's involvement in projects connected to Africa was not just about philanthropy. It was about positioning himself inside networks that linked global science, funding, and influence. And once he became part of those networks, his interests began drifting toward an even more controversial area of conversation.
They were specifically seeking to offer digital ID. Well, it's already happened. They gave a digital ID essentially to 5 million Ethiopian school children with the intention of expanding that. And the whole intention of this is to harvest data from these children. They explicitly say that.
Because among the scientists he interacted with, Epstein often raised questions about something far more radical than education or research funding. He wanted to talk about the future of humanity itself. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Once Epstein had inserted himself into scientific circles, his conversations began to reveal something unusual about the way he thought about science. He was not simply interested in supporting research or funding education. According to several scientists who later described their interactions with him, Epstein often pushed discussions toward a far more controversial idea: the possibility of shaping the future of humanity through biology. In private meetings and gatherings, he reportedly asked questions about intelligence, inheritance, and how human traits might evolve over generations. Some scientists later said that Epstein spoke about the possibility of spreading his own DNA widely by fathering many children, imagining that such a strategy could influence the future human population. These remarks shocked many people when they became public because they echoed an ideology with a long and troubling history. The concept Epstein appeared fascinated by was closely related to eugenics, an idea historically associated with Francis Galton. Eugenics proposed that human societies could be improved through selective reproduction, encouraging certain traits while discouraging others. Although these theories were widely rejected after the 20th century because they were used to justify discrimination and human rights abuses, fragments of the thinking still surface in modern debates about genetics and biotechnology. What makes Epstein's fascination with these ideas particularly unsettling is the context in which he discussed them. He was not an isolated thinker writing speculative essays. He was interacting with scientists working on real research projects. His money allowed him to sit in rooms where discussions about genetics, evolution, and emerging technologies were taking place. When someone with wealth and influence starts exploring ideas about altering humanity's biological future, it raises deeper questions about the intersection of power and science. And this is where Africa quietly returns to the story. Any serious conversation about human genetics eventually arrives at the same geographic reality. Africa contains the deepest and most complex genetic diversity on the planet. Because modern humans originated on the continent, African populations preserved genetic variations that disappeared in other regions as humans migrated outward. For scientists studying evolution or disease resistance, this diversity is invaluable. It provides insights into how the human body adapts to different environments and how genetic traits influence health. Epstein's fascination with human genetics did not mean he was conducting experiments in Africa. There is no credible evidence that he ran programs or projects involving African populations, in the way some rumors suggest. But his ideas reveal something about the intellectual landscape surrounding modern genetics. When discussions turn toward understanding or even influencing human biology, Africa becomes central because the continent holds the most extensive archive of human DNA. In other words, even when outsiders talk about the future of humanity, the story repeatedly circles back to Africa. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time you trace Epstein's network through science, philanthropy, and elite travel circles, a pattern begins to emerge that goes far beyond one individual. Epstein was not the first wealthy Western figure to appear around Africa's development and research conversations, and he certainly was not the last. For decades, Africa has played a unique role in global elite networks. It is a place where political leaders launch humanitarian campaigns, where billionaires fund charitable initiatives, and where international institutions experiment with development strategies. Conferences, global summits, and philanthropic missions frequently place Africa at the center of discussions about poverty, health, and economic transformation. These environments create something extremely valuable for powerful outsiders: reputation. Supporting development projects or humanitarian programs in Africa often allows wealthy individuals to present themselves as global benefactors. Philanthropy becomes a way to gain legitimacy, credibility, and influence in international circles. This phenomenon is sometimes described by analysts as reputation laundering. A billionaire who funds education programs or health initiatives in Africa is often seen as a visionary philanthropist. the narrative shifts from how that wealth was accumulated to how it is being used to improve the world. Epstein appeared to understand this dynamic very well. By associating himself with scientific initiatives, development discussions, and philanthropic networks connected to Africa, he crafted an image that allowed him to move among political leaders, researchers, and influential thinkers. This strategy did not require him to run major programs on the continent. Simply appearing within these circles helped reinforce the perception that he was part of the global effort to address major challenges facing humanity. Africa became one of the places where this reputation-building environment existed. But this raises a deeper question about how global power operates. If Africa repeatedly becomes the stage where powerful outsiders build influence through philanthropy, development, and scientific projects, what does that say about how the continent is viewed within international elite networks? And more importantly, if Africa has historically been the setting where outsiders shape narratives about development and progress, could the continent eventually change that dynamic entirely? Because the final piece of this story is not about Epstein at all. It is about how Africa itself is beginning to redefine the role it plays in the global system. By the time the pieces of this story come together, something becomes clear. The Epstein episode was never just about a single individual moving through elite circles. It was a glimpse into how global power networks operate and how Africa often appears within those networks. Epstein used money, connections, and philanthropy to place himself near influential conversations. He moved between scientists, politicians, and international development figures. Occasionally, those networks intersected with Africa, whether through travel, development discussions, or scientific partnerships. But the larger lesson is not about Epstein himself. It is about the role Africa plays in the global imagination of powerful institutions and wealthy elites. For decades, the continent has been portrayed as a place where solutions must arrive from outside. Development programs, humanitarian missions, and international initiatives have often framed Africa as a problem waiting for external expertise. Yet the very reason those initiatives keep returning to Africa reveals something different. Africa is central to many of the world's most important questions. It is a continent of enormous natural resources, the youngest population on Earth, and the birthplace of modern humanity. Its markets are expanding, its cities are growing rapidly, and its scientific communities are becoming increasingly influential. That combination makes Africa impossible to ignore. When global elites talk about the future, whether the topic is economics, technology, or scientific discovery, Africa inevitably enters the conversation. Sometimes it appears through development programs, sometimes through research collaborations, sometimes through diplomatic visits or international forums. The Epstein story shows how individuals with wealth and connections try to move inside those conversations. His presence in scientific meetings, philanthropic environments, and international trips demonstrated how access to resources can open doors into powerful networks. But it also exposed something else. Those networks often operate quietly, far from public scrutiny. Wealthy donors, researchers, and policymakers interact in private environments where ideas about development, science, and global priorities are discussed long before they appear in public policy. Africa frequently becomes part of those discussions because its future matters to the future of the world. Yet the most important shift happening today is that Africa is increasingly participating in those conversations on its own terms. African leaders, scientists, and institutions are expanding their influence in global debates about technology, development, and knowledge. Instead of being spoken about, Africa is speaking for itself. The Epstein story, therefore, serves as an unexpected reminder of something larger. It shows how global power networks sometimes view Africa as a stage where influence, philanthropy, and reputation are built. But it also hints at a new possibility. What happens when the continent that has so often been the subject of these discussions becomes one of the places where the decisions are actually made? Let us know in the comment section. How many more Epsteins will Africa allow to benefit from it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.